Hi, everyone. Welcome to the National Equine Conference call for the month of April. We do have some folks that are still joining us, so you will hear a few little beeps coming in, but I ask you all to put yourselves on mute so that we don't distract the speakers for today. As always, I thank those of you that have provided some speaker topics or speaker suggestions. As we move forward, I continue to receive those and appreciate those. So again, our monthly conference calls will continue. Oh, hold on. Let me just we have a bunch of people in the waiting room. Give me 1 minute. Okay, I believe we have all folks from the waiting room admitted. So again, I thank you all for sending topics. We will have our next call on May, the second Thursday of the month, as always. And just so everyone's aware, I did receive a bunch of requests for equine influenza to be discussed on the next call. So I'm trying to secure a speaker for that purpose. If there's any additional topics or questions you have, please feel free to send my way. And so thank you to those that
if you search for
speaker suggestions for today's call. And without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Lutz Goring, who is at the Gluck Equine Research Center, and he's going to give us an update on some of the research he's been conducting related to EHV1. Dr. Goring, I might have just muted you. I accidentally muted everybody. So I think we need to unmute you. Dr. Goring, we need to unmute you. Can you unmute yourself? Sorry.
Okay.
All right.
I thought I did. Thank you, Dr. Flynn,
go.
for the introduction, and thank you for having me over for this presentation. It will be, the main focus will be on EHV1 latency, our most recent findings. But before I do that, I will present a little bit of an overview of what it is and what we know so far. So there is a wider and a more narrow definition of latency. The more wider definition kind of sticks to several pathogens that cause disease in any mammal or humans, even probably other species as well. This terminology is used as a, it's kind of a low grade, it's a slow presence of a pathogen in a stage of chronic persistent infection, resulting in subclinical or mild clinical disease. When you talk about herpes viruses, and we want to talk about alpha herpes viruses today, there's a more strict definition for this. Latency is a truly dormant stage somewhere in the body of the infected. It results from an acute lytic infection and is a form of retreat where virus retreats in the body, in tissues somewhere. And very commonly with alpha herpes viruses, the retreat is in the neural parenchyma, in neuronal peripheral ganglia, either sensory or sympathetic, parasympathetic. The difference between, and now I don't know why I can't advance my slides. Let me see. There we go. So the difference between the two states is that during active lytic infection, where virus actively replicates, it makes use of all three genome sequences that are defined in the herpes viruses as the immediate early gene, the early gene, and the late gene. It uses all components, and it's a cascade of events with a final result, a complete and intact virus. As we can see here on the left side, a virus with a capsid, its DNA packaged in there, and a nice envelope around it that allows cell infection of a neighboring cell or de novo infection. The latent infection is different. It's an arrested, truly dormant stage of infection, where only a small restricted area of the genome is transcribed. And this is the segment of the immediate early gene. And we can see that on that circle plot here on the left. This is an example of varicella zoster, lytic versus latent replication. The most outer circle is actually the blue and red that are the different genome sequences of varicella zoster virus. The next more inner cycle is actually all the transcripts, RNA transcripts that are produced during lytic infection. You can see it's all the way around. You see these spikes either towards the outside or inside. So this is activity all the way around the genome here versus representing a lytic infection. If you go one more cycle towards the inner of these circles, we see very restricted activity. And I hope you can see my mouse now going over the slides. We see this little tiny area here. This is ORF61 for varicella zoster. This represents those segments that are typically produced or transcribed during latent infection only. The importance of latency is this is like a time capsule. This is like a hiding place. This is a sleeper cell, if you want to say it that way, because from there, virus can reactivate. It typically goes back to the site where it originally infects, where it originally causes replication and infection, which would be for the horse, the respiratory tract, coming from either the respiratory tract associated lymph nodes or from the trigeminal ganglion, causing replication in the epithelial cells, and being shed from there into the environment. Horizontal infection is the next part where other horses in the vicinity can become infected. So far, and this is unusual for alpha herpes viruses in the horse, EHV1 genome has been detected in the trigeminal ganglia, in the respiratory tract, but also in the respiratory tract associated lymph nodes, mandibular lymph node, the retropharyngeal lymph nodes, and to a lesser degree also in PBMC. This is unusual because I said at the very beginning, alpha herpes viruses are typically those that retreat and cause latent infection, more likely in the neural parenchyma of the associated surfaces where this virus replicates. Nicola Pusterla in California did a study in 2010 in a racetrack population, 3 to 7 year old thoroughbreds at a racetrack. And yes, he confirmed we see EHV1 and EHV4 in the trigeminal ganglion and in the mandibular lymph nodes. A second study followed with Dr. Pusterla as a co-investigator in that. They looked into intensive care hospitalized horses and ponies in Michigan. While looking at the mandibular lymph nodes only, they were not able to find any genome copies there in those mandibular lymph nodes, making them coming up with the conclusion that very likely there are regional differences regarding prevalence of EHV1 or EHV4 latency. Samoilova and Giesler in 2 studies, they looked at experimentally infected yearlings. They took several other sites, tissue sites, into consideration, whether this is all restricted to yearlings that were experimentally infected and results or tissues were collected by day 70 post-infection. A quick overview. This is a collaboration between the University of Munich, my previous my previous home basically, and Michigan State University. You see here horizontally, you see 3 groups of horses infected with 3 different viruses, and the most upper part here, this is wild type EHV1. We see on the left lymphatic tissues, here the respiratory tract associated lymphatic tissues, pharyngeal roof, the mandibular lymph nodes, the retropharyngeal lymph nodes, the bronchial lymph nodes, and then further to the right, as a more or less as a control, the spleen and the mesenteric lymph nodes here. When we go all the way to the right, we see sensory ganglia here, trigeminal ganglion, dorsal root ganglion, and various sympathetic, parasympathetic ganglia collected in these yearling horses by day 70 after the infection. And quite easy, you can see red, yellow, and white. That represents high genomic copy load, yellow moderate genome copy load, and white is a negative find. The gray zones is we couldn't find either cells, or we couldn't find the ganglia in all that stuff we got out of these horses. Not an easy task, but you see that there is quite some distribution also over additional sites. We didn't know what that meant and how virus ended up there at the other sites that are not directly associated with the respiratory tract where this virus initially replicates. We believe that the alternative sites are colonized by viremia and are transported by infected lymphocytes, monocytes, and reach these sites differently. And we wanted to go into further details and study the transcriptome of these tissues and identify viral transcriptional activity in those tissues. Again, this is next generation sequencing of viral RNA. This was in a group of horses also experimentally infected. However, this is a day 30 post-infection experiment. We collected several more tissues, but we restricted, because of costs, we restricted this analysis to 3 different sites. We looked at the retropharyngeal lymph nodes. We looked at the trigeminal ganglia. We looked at the mesenteric lymph nodes. And these are the results. You can easily see that there is, on the x-axis here, these are our open reading frames, the different segments of our herpes virus genome here. We see them numbered by from 1 to 76. We can easily see that there are no results. It's a clean line with the retropharyngeal lymph nodes, despite the fact that these tissue samples were positive for genome, for EHV1 genome. When we go to the mesenteric lymph nodes, we see stacks of reads here, in numbers of reads here, in about the 1,000, between 100 and 1,000 ballpark figure here, but smeared out over the entire genome of these horses, implying a low-grade lytic infection. When we look at the TGs here at this stage, we see a very defined, distinct number of reads, very distinctly organized around ORF 63 and 64. And to no surprise, this is the immediate early gene sequence here, where we see a very high number of transcripts coming from this section here. So these 2 slides here they tell us, it looks like the classic pattern of latent infection is realized here in the trigeminal ganglion here. While when we look at the other positive tissues, this is still low-grade. This is still low-grade lytic infection. This is 30 days post-infection. So this is homing into lymph nodes. This is recirculation. So no surprise that we find these data, that we find this kind of data in in the mesenteric lymph nodes here. And again, the mesenteric lymph nodes here, that represents the next inner circle of the transcripts of this circle plot here for varicella zoster, while the most inner circle here, this is the read for the latent infection that's characteristic for trigeminal ganglia also in varicella zoster. When we look in our most recent study, we wanted to look whether we have similar findings in a random population of horses. When we if we have differences, if we the final goal is to get like fresh samples from different age groups and see if their transcriptional activity differs between these horses, or if we still get this strict pattern of transcriptional activity different from the trigeminal ganglion versus the lymphatic tissues. We collected a set of samples from about 90 horses, mainly thoroughbred and standardbred horses, few warm bloods, draft horses that were submitted to the University of Kentucky Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory. They did not have a recent history of EHV1, known EHV1 infection. And their age range was between 7 months of age up to 25 years of age. That allowed us to make 3 groups of horses with about 30 horses in each group. A young group here, less than 2 years of age, a group between 2 and 10 years of age, and a group of horses between 11 and 25 years of age. We collected 3 tissues, the trigeminal ganglion, retropharyngeal lymph node, and the pharyngeal roof. And after processing, which included embedding and H&E staining, we also took cut sections of these blocks and did PCR on them, quantitative PCR on them to identify the numbers of EHV1 genome copies. And before I discuss the results with you, just an overview of the graphs, because they don't read that easily. We have a prevalence here of genome presence in the various tissues. We have here the highest margin here set at 80%. Just to make sure this is not 100%, the 100% mark. So this is the 80% mark here. We have the 3 tissues. We have the trigeminal ganglion. We have the retropharyngeal lymph node here. And then most to the right, we have the pharyngeal roof. We have in gray EHV4 results. We have in pink EHV1 results. And each graph has the 3 age groups. Yearlings, most to the left. In the middle, the 2 to 10-year-old horses, and over 10 years of horses here in the most right part of these graphs. Here are our results. This was a little bit expected. So there is cohabitation of EHV1 and EHV4 in all tissues we collected. The TG has the highest prevalence for both viruses, while the EHV4 dominates actually in the TG. Furthermore, if you look at the TG, actually in all 3 slides, it's quite astounding that EHV4 actually dominates early on in life. So we see these 73% prevalence here in our yearlings, 27% over 4% when we look at the retropharyngeal lymph nodes. And this is actually something that fits very nicely with my clinical experience and with clinical experience of others I talked to about this. And also with data we got from studies on the nasal swab studies, where if a young horse with a fever, it is more likely a really young horse, a weanling or a yearling horse with a fever and respiratory disease, if it suffers from EHV, it's more likely to find EHV4 in those guys rather than EHV1. Apparently, it looks like that from these graphs here that EHV1 catches up or takes over later in life, according to those bars when it comes to prevalence in these different tissues. There's also a difference between group 2 and group 3. It seems a little bit, if you look at the trigeminal ganglion again, it seems to me a little bit as a more saturation for EHV1 here in the TG. There's no further or no dramatic increase from group 2 to group 3, despite the fact that another 10 years of potential exposure come with these older horses. There's a decrease in EHV1 for EHV1 and 4. When we look at the retropharyngeal lymph nodes here in the middle, we see a decrease here on both of these plots here. And there's an increase for EHV1 when we look at the pharyngeal roof. We don't know exactly what that means. We also still have to stand still at the point that we have to say this is a small number of samples only for these 3 different age groups. However, could it be that there is a redistribution from 2 sides towards the respiratory tract, towards the pharyngeal roof, as the pharyngeal roof is actually a very interesting tissue, because it contains lymphoid follicles, but it also contains the sensory endings of our savings account, call it that way, the trigeminal ganglion. And it also contains the respiratory epithelium, which is like one of the primary sites for this virus, where it replicates freely in epithelial cells. So could it be that this is redistribution, and we see from that age on that there is a relative more frequent spread of this virus at older age? We are very interested to see transcriptional activity of these sites. However, this requires a new set of tissues because of the surveillance of RNA in tissues. This needs to be really freshly collected, and we need to follow a different strategy for that. Want to end with this, thanking a ton of people at 4 different institutions, and of course my funding, the Grace and Jockey Club Research Foundation, the Gluck Equine Research Foundation, and the German Gesellschaft für Pferdemedizin that financed the initial parts of this study. Thank you very much. Open for questions.
Dr. Goring, thank you for your great presentation. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. If you would like to put them in the chat, please do so. And if we don't get to all of them, we'll happy to get Dr. Goring to answer them at a later time and send out the answers. I did get one though in Dr. Goring, and the question was, what is the overall prevalence of latency regardless of location for EHV1 and EHV4?
This is a simple answer we can't say. You know, they could be very different, right? It could be that if we look at Paris or London, you know, it could be 50% combined when we look at chronic persistent infection in the TG and the lymphatics combined. It's not, I don't buy that it's like the 80, 90, 100%, everybody casually says like, or mentions talking about chronic persistent infection. It's not in all horses, it's in many horses, but it's also somewhere, it's probably not in all of these horses. And regional differences, I would say, is the difference. It could be different in California versus Kentucky versus East Coast. Could be different Argentina versus United States, Northern Hemisphere versus Southern Hemisphere. We don't know. It would be very interesting to investigate into that.
And we have one other question. Was there a correlation with serology?
We did not look into serology.
Okay, that's all the questions I see for right now. If you have additional ones, please feel free to put them in the chat and we can answer them if we have time towards the end of the call today, or we can answer them at a later time and we'll get those answers out to folks. So thank you, Dr. Goring. We appreciate your time. All right, moving on. Before I forgot to mention at the beginning, these calls are being recorded and they will be posted within a week to the Equine Disease Communication Center under their news section. So these recordings will be available for anyone to view at a later time. So with that being said, I'm going to move on to our next topic, and we're getting a equine infectious anemia update from California specifically. And it's Dr. Josh Kloppel, who is the new equine staff veterinarian for the California Department of Food and Agriculture. While he's unmuting his line, I will also mention that I did attach in the email today, or previously, excuse me, with today's agenda, recently published equine infectious anemia article of interest. So Josh, can you hear me?
I can. Do you guys have me?
Yes, go right ahead. Thank you.
All right, sounds good. So I'll kind of go through this more with like a timeline so that it kind of flows. If at any point, Katie, I need to repeat anything, please just flag me down. So we've had recent cases, a couple of different recent cases that Katie asked me to present. And so we've had different cases in a couple of different counties, and I'll give a quick rundown of each one. So on September 22nd of last year, 2023, CDFA, the Department of Food and Agriculture, was notified of a non-negative EIA sample that was received by IDEX. It was for a 4-year-old quarter horse gelding. On the 23rd, the next day, one of our livestock inspectors reached out to the owner and gave a verbal quarantine and discussed one of our veterinarians coming out and making a site visit and getting an additional regulatory sample, which is part of the procedures we do within the department here. So on Monday the 25th, a regulatory veterinarian went out with our livestock inspector, did a site visit, animal evaluation, and then pulled those regulatory samples. We do duplicate samples on all of our EIA suspect cases, where one is the EIA sample and the other is a pyroplasmosis test. They kind of go hand in hand with us. And in discussing with USDA's Dr. Pelzo McCluskey, we always submit those here in California with any of our EIA suspect cases. And so that sample was pulled and submitted to our local CAFS lab, as well as they then sent it on to NVSL. It was confirmed positive within our CAFS lab as well as at NVSL. On the on October 4th, we received that information. So we were waiting for results from the 25th to that time, and that horse was confirmed positive. Now, this case took a little bit of an interesting turn because when our regulatory veterinarian and livestock inspector went out to do the site visit, the home address that was listed on the EIA test form that was submitted by the private practitioner was a solo animal property. Now, we know, because we've dealt with a lot of these, especially in recent years, that the overrepresented group that we see the majority, if not all, of our EIA cases in are pretty, up to speed on our proceedings, and they try and circumvent that to have as minimal impact on their trainings and proceedings on a day-to-day basis. So this horse was at a backyard premises completely by itself. The one thing that helped us in this case was that on the test form, the private practitioner had listed the location of where the sample was taken, and it was an off-site training facility, off-site meaning not the home address. So quick story behind that was when we started looking into this, we found out from the private practitioner, he did normal work for this training facility that was off-site. the owner of this horse had gotten in contact with him just through knowing some of the guys that were part of this training facility. The veterinarian told him, I don't have availability in the time you need that test, but if you can get the horse over to this training facility, I can pull the sample and get it submitted for you. In knowing the group at the training facility, that was no problem. The horse was on site for a couple hours, sample was pulled, and then went back home. Again, I have to make special note, this is as much information as we gather and can try and sift through how accurate and true it is to what really happened. We always have to take that, with a grain of salt for really what it is for us. But this really helped us because being that this came back positive, we then had, the jurisdiction to go to the training facility, being that it was the location of the sample drawn, and do trace out follow-up samples on all qualified equine on that property. And so it was within the same county. And so we went to that property on October 5th, and we pulled 24 additional samples. There were 27 total horses on that property, or equids in general. They did not have any mules, donkeys, or anything else, but it was all horses. 3 of those were foals under 6 months, which we did not sample. So out of the 27, we sampled 24 adult horses on the trace facility that the horse got the original sample pulled for. Quick backtrack, the original horse was tested because it had a carpal chip surgery upcoming, and the clinic that was going to perform the surgery required that the Coggins form, a current Coggins form be submitted before arrival. And so then like I said, on October 5th, we went out and pulled additional samples on the 24 horses at the training facility. Both facilities, the home facility of the confirmed positive horse was placed under quarantine. That horse was euthanized and hauled off. And so that being a single animal property, that quarantine was essentially lifted because there were no additional animals on site that needed to sit through our quarantine proceedings and period. The training facility was placed under quarantine the day we went out and sampled the 24 horses. When those samples came back from CAFs and NVSL, we had 2 additional horses come up positive on that location. Both horses were 4-year-old quarter horse geldings, and owner was notified. Another thing about this property that was interesting is the owner of the property had some horses on site, but he rented stall space to this group that were training horses. Quarter horse, racehorse quarter horses. And so those 2 horses were found to be positive. We arranged with the owner to witness the euthanasia of those 2, and they hauled them off, and a quarantine was placed on the additional horses, awaiting a 60-day retest, which is our follow-up procedure. As that time went by, we went back for the 60-day resample test on December 12th. And that was the scheduled date. It got pushed back because of scheduling. So on the 20th of December of 2023, we went back for the 60-day retest. When we received those results back, we had an additional detection and a confirmed positive through NVSL with 1 additional horse, this time being a 2-year-old gelding quarter horse. And that horse was also euthanized and removed from the property. The property remained under quarantine, and they went through another 60-day waiting period. And on March 14th of this year, of 2024, the second 60-day samples results were returned. All remaining horses were negative, and that quarantine was effectively released. One special note that kind of spills over into the next case is that what we see here, especially in Southern California, is we're seeing a lot of these, if not all of the EIA detections that we're getting, or EIA non-negatives, are coming from a pretty small niche group of unsanctioned, or what we refer to as bush track racing quarter horses. Now you'll get your appendix horse in there every once in a while, and sometimes some thoroughbreds will be in these barns, but the overwhelming overrepresentation is in the running quarter horses. And so this is a whole intricate world in and of itself, the deeper you get into it. When I was in private practice, I had some experience with it in that I had clients that I knew their horses ran on these bush tracks or these unsanctioned tracks, doing normal sports med stuff for those horses as we would any other client. But knowing that this is a pretty intricate world, it's very, very well ran from within. When you start to see how they really minimize their risk. There's a lot of, obviously illegal bets and wagering and stuff like that takes place off-site. So there's a whole thing behind this that just trying to get information to really track these and trace these is really tough. There's a lot of interstate movement of these horses, going to and from races on the weekends and things like that. And the involvement of everybody involved is very difficult because there's partnerships and owners, and there's, some of the grooms own part of this horse and this, and this group, and there's a bunch of interconnected crossover with these training groups. They refer to themselves as cuadras. It's Spanish for basically it's a race team. And so these are all the different little training barns and race groups. And oftentimes, because in Southern California, what we really have is a shortage of space, free space or free land is not a commodity we are high up on here in Southern California. So a lot of times you'll have multiple race groups in one property, and they just have, 6 stalls as one race group, 10 other stalls as another race group. They're buddies, and there's a lot of crossover. So we see where this iatrogenic infections really take place. The reason I explain all of that is the next case, our most recent case in LA County, was detected on March 7th of this year of 2024, where we got 2 non-negatives from IDEX again, went out, did our follow-up, pulled regulatory samples on those 2 horses, and resubmitted for confirmation. They were confirmed. One was a 4-year-old quarter horse gelding. The other was an 8-year-old quarter horse gelding. Again, these 2 horses were tested for routine testing because they were actually due to go to a sanctioned local track here, and needed a current Coggins to be able to get on the track to go into training. That's where the detection came from. The site visit was at a private property that had 10 additional horses beyond the 2 that were detected. On our follow-up visit, it happened to be the same day that the euthanasias were scheduled, so we witnessed those, collected our information there, and did that, and then collected samples on the 10 remaining horses on site. No other animals were on site. It was strictly horses, and all 10 of them were qualified age groups and were tested. And on those, we luckily did not have any additional positives or detections there. So they are currently in a holding pattern in their quarantine. The interesting note that I was trying to give a little bit of background on these race groups is one of my trusty colleagues, Katie Hatch, is excellent at doing the epi on these cases, especially in this unsanctioned world. Luckily for our sake, they do seem to put everything online through social media and through these different groups. They post on everything. They really, as a group, they really like to have the horses' names out there. They really like to display their race groups or like I said, their quadra names. And so that goes a long way in us being able to get some additional information, or if at the very least trying to see the associations between the different race groups or where these horses have kind of been and things like that. One of the horses that tested positive at this LA County location has a history of being run under one of the race groups that we identified at the previous location in Riverside County that I mentioned before with the 24 horses, where we had 3 total detections. And so seeing the connection there gives us at least, you know, the comfort of knowing that we are seeing where these exposures and infections are linked and taking place. So one of the race groups, you know, advertised this horse, one of the 2 horses at this LA County specifically, as running for them. I want to say it was roughly a year or 2 ago. And so that link there really kind of put a bow on it for us, knowing that, which we already knew these were all interlinked, and they continue to be interlinked. And we see, you know, they all communicate, they follow each other on social media and really know what the other is doing. And so we're here in California. One of our endeavors with our equine department is moving forward. We're going to try and really get as much outreach and stuff as we can to these groups. We're seeing that the problem here is just really lack of understanding. It becomes so second nature to them that this is the world they come into. They see it, whether it's as a casual fan to start, and then they say, oh, this is fun, I want to be in it. And so then they dive in, they want to get, you know, partial ownership in a horse, they make a little money, and then they own their own horse. And they see that, oh, you know, whether it's, you know, bad products that they're getting internationally that are contaminated, or it's multi-use medication vials, it's the drip sets that they reuse for pre-race vitamins or whatever other medications or drugs they're using on these horses. And so while we obviously don't condone any of those practices, we know it's going to take place. So getting the education and outreach to them that this is the point of infection and transmission is really the hard part, because they just do not understand that that risk is out there. They know we test for EIA. They don't really even know what that is. They really just know that it's a test they need to be able to leave the state, come into the state, or go to the sanctioned tracks. And so that's where we're at with those 2 cases. The other noteworthy thing is most of these horses do come from a sanctioned racetrack background. A lot of times they've had a couple of outs. You know, they maybe didn't do well. You know, they didn't run in top finishing positions, and then they were picked up at a claims race, or they were sold for cheap just to get out from under the training costs and board. And then they convert these horses that were running on the sanctioned tracks here in California off into the bush track or the unsanctioned track world, where the, you know, they give them some supplements, if you will, and do that additionally. So those are the 2 cases that we've had that Katie asked me to speak on. I'm happy to answer questions. I wanted to leave some time for questions in case this is something more unique to our world that we've seen quite a bit in the past 5 years, especially. We've seen quite a few of these cases and several detections. And so I'm more than happy to answer questions if anybody has those, as far as how we proceed through these, or what we're seeing with these EIA detections that we seem to have here in California.
Thanks, Josh. Again, we have time for maybe 1 question, and if you have additional questions, I can get them to Josh and we'll get an answer back for you. Josh, the 1 question that I have is, did you check the brands or tattoos on these horses, especially the 3-4-year-olds that are all the same age? Do they have any commonality in tattoo numbers?
So we do run tattoos, microchips, and brands. We include all of those. We check those. I wouldn't say that the tattoo numbers or things like that have a direct link for us. The hard part is there's only a couple of tracks, the sanctioned tracks, where they would be getting tattooed in their early sanctioned race life, where they're there. So if they're all similar age, they're going to be getting, you know, tattooed and having those things at similar times, given the, you know, pretty uniform start times on these younger running quarter horses. So to answer your question, that is not usually where we see our links. Our link usually comes, especially with these unsanctioned or this bush track racing world, is the links are a lot easier to you know, associate them by their race team or their quadra names, and them publishing the horse's name that they they use, because if they win, they want it to be known. This is
Yeah.
not something that they keep quiet. It is not something that they feel the need to fly under the radar. It is all about as much publicity as possible. Our race team name and the horse's name, if it's a winner and we won money, we want the bush track world to know we have a good running horse, because that builds for future races. They can wager more money on them. So there's a lot of incentive for them to do that, which does work in and play into, into our hand on all the epi. But unfortunately, the tattoos and the brands don't do a whole lot for us, especially because the pedigree that these guys, really focus on are the popular ones. We see a ton of Corona Cartel horses, things like that, where they're the popular racetrack horses because they're, solid running pedigree and things like that. But these guys want them as well because they know they're faster, they're the popular name, and they can sell them and do things like that. So we do see a lot of that as well.
All right, well, we're gonna have to transition. If you have any other questions, put them in the chat and I'm happy to get them answered for you. Moving on, thanks Josh, and moving on, we're gonna go to Dr. Sarah McNitt with our USDA import-export staff. And she's gonna give us an overview of importation protocols for horses from South Africa. Go ahead, Dr. McNitt.
Okay. So I am sharing my slide. If you can't, sharing my screen.
Yep,
If you
we can see it. You're good.
cool, let me know. So I'm going to do a quick introduction and then jump into it because I am new to my position. So I recently joined the live animal imports team, Equine Imports, as a staff veterinary medical officer. Some of you may have known me from my previous position where I served as the veterinarian in charge of collateral ports for 4 years. Katie invited me to present to you guys today to talk to you guys a little bit about African horse sickness import requirements, and try to get through the time, but not let my Michigan speed talk get in the way of anything. African horse sickness is caused by the African horse sickness virus. It's a double-stranded RNA virus of the family Reoviridae, genus Orbivirus. There are 9 antigenically distinct serotypes identified by virus neutralization. The usual hosts are equids, horses, mules, donkeys, and zebra. The mortality rates are much higher in horses, so it's generally 70 to 95% mortality rate in horses. Mules, it's about 50%, donkeys, 10%. Zebras and African donkeys are subclinical, and they believe that zebras are a reservoir host for this virus. It is not zoonotic. No human cases have been seen after contact with field strains of African horse sickness. Transmission is by biting insects, usually biting midges. The Culicoides species is the one that is most often identified. Incubation period is 3 days, up to 2 weeks, though it may be as long as 21 days. And the World Organization for Animal Health notes that the infective period is 40 days. There is no specific treatment for African horse sickness, so it's just supportive care. And prevention involves insect control measures, eliminating the midge breeding sites, stabling horses in vector-proof barns from dusk until dawn. Don't reuse needles, as we learned from the last presentation as well. And it can be killed by heating it above 140 degrees Fahrenheit and by using disinfectants with a pH of less than 6 or greater than 11. There are four clinical manifestations. The first one is the fever, and this is presents as fever, low-grade undulating fevers. It's higher in the afternoons and lower in the mornings. You will also see, move there because I've moved everything. The horses will also present with malaise, shortness of breath. This manifestation rarely results in death. You most often see this in donkeys, zebras, and vaccinated horses. The next one is the cardiac or the subacute edematous form. This one presents as a mild fever, resolves in less than a week, but then it progresses to swelling of supraorbital fossa, eyelids, facial tissues, neck, thorax, brisket, and shoulders. You don't see swelling in the legs with this disease. The horses will also present with depression, petechiae and ecchymosis on the ventral surface of the tongue and conjunctiva, colic, and then there's a 50% mortality with death usually within a week with this presentation. The next manifestation is pulmonary or the pure acute. This one has fever progressing within a few days to depression, profuse sweating, dyspnea, severe coughing, pulmonary edema, dilated nostrils with frothy fluid oozing out of them. You can also see congestion of the conjunctiva, and this one has a 95% mortality rate, and death is usually within a week from anorexia. And then the most common form is the mix. And this you have a mixture of cardiac and pulmonary forms, and this is also known as the acute form. You'll start out with the mild pulmonary signs that don't generally progress. The cardiac signs develop later than the pulmonary signs. And with the cardiac signs, that's when you'll see edematous swelling and swellings and effusions, cardiac failure. And this one has a 70 to 80% mortality rate. So for import requirements, horses entering from South Africa must undergo the African horse sickness protocols. That's what we're going to be covering in this presentation. Screw-in protocols, contagious equine metritis protocols, and foot and mouth disease protocols. So per CFR, horses intended for importation from regions APHIS considers to be affected with African horse sickness may enter the United States only at the Port of New York and must be quarantined at the New York Animal Import Center in Newburgh, New York for at least 60 days. For African horse sickness, we consider all horses in the shipment to be cohorts. So for when they actually get to the US, how we're handling them is once they arrive at JFK, all the horses are sprayed with insect repellent as they're being removed from the jet stalls. The jet stalls and bedding are sprayed with insect repellent after the horses were removed. Bedding was removed and incinerated. Jet stalls were sprayed with disinfectant, and the truck used to transport the horses was sprayed with insect repellent before the horses were loaded and again after the horses were removed. The ARC walkthrough was also sprayed with disinfectant after the horses had passed through. Once the horses reached Nyack, the horses were sprayed with Atraban, and the truck and intake barn were sprayed with Virkon. Before the horses even arrived, the importers had to provide a vector protected conveyance to move these horses. And this had to be inspected by APHIS at least 72 hours before the horse's arrival. And it has to remain available while the horses are under federal quarantine so that we can transport the horses should they need to be moved. When it is tapped for use, it will be sprayed with insect repellent before the horses are loaded and again after the horses are removed. So while in quarantine, access to the horses prior to negative African horse sickness testing will be restricted to just APHIS personnel and accredited veterinarians only. APHIS personnel are walking these horses daily, will be walking horses daily. Once we have negative African horse sickness test results, we will still only allow necessary visitors. For instance, a farrier and any equipment that is brought in will need to be cleaned and disinfected prior to leaving the quarantine as per standard procedures. If a horse needs veterinary care at a referral clinic during the quarantine period, it will be transferred in the vector protected conveyance to the approved veterinary clinic associated with Nyack. It will be kept in vector-proof quarantine during hospitalization, and movement from the stall will require VMO oversight. So import testing, all testing is to be performed at our NVSL labs. This includes both CBC and chemistry testing if determined necessary by the accredited veterinarian. Upon arrival at the port of entry, all horses will be tested for the APHIS regulated diseases, equine infectious anemia, puroplasmosis, dorine, and glanders. Between days 40 to 45 of import quarantine, whole blood samples will be collected for African horse sickness agent identification by PCR. Any horses showing clinical signs with African horse sickness, consistent with African horse sickness during the quarantine period, will be tested by agent identification for African horse sickness, and any horses testing non-negative, skipped ahead of me, any horses testing non-negative will be refused entry, and all horses all cohorts to the horse testing non-negative will be refused entry. And so for the shipments, those are, since the entire shipment is considered a cohort, all horses as part of that shipment will be refused entry. So in order for horses to qualify for release, once the horses have met all import requirements, including the 60 days in federal quarantine at NIAC, testing negative for aphis diseases of concern, as mentioned previously, and they've also met all requirements of screwworm and FMD protocols, and the mares and stallions have completed their 30-day CEM quarantine. These horses can be released into the domestic population. APHIS has been working very closely with the New York State Animal Health official throughout the planning and execution of the import, and APHIS will notify the state animal health officials of the destination states after the African horse sickness testing, but also prior to release. And if you have any questions, you can go ahead and contact us there. And that is the end of my presentation, and I did it in just a little running over. So any questions?
Great job, Sarah. Great job. I do have a question that came in, and if anybody else has a question, again, put it in the chat. And if we don't get to it, I'm sure we can get an answer from USDA. The one question that I've gotten before this call, and again, thank you for the folks that suggested to get this topic on the agenda. Regarding the vaccination status of the horses, is that part of the permitting process to determine if these horses have been vaccinated for African horse sickness? And if they have, what is the testing concerns related to potential vaccination status?
Katie, I will have to look into that and get back to you with an answer on that one.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Any other questions or comments or concerns? So the other one that I have, just because I'm not seeing any, the other one that I have is, what type of exercise are they allowed while they're in import quarantine for 60 days?
So right now they are just being hand walked by the grooms, because we do have to restrict access, and so they will continue to be hand walked while they are in import quarantine. Sorry, not by the grooms, by APHIS personnel. They'll be hand walked while they're in import quarantine.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions. Let me check the chat really quick. Have these horses had any issues since they have arrived?
Not that
That's just a general question regarding the shipment that's here, I guess.
So yeah, we're really kind of just talking about we're trying to focus in on the actual requirements. So as far as how the horses have been doing, that is a question that we can get back to you guys on, because I was just focusing on the actual requirements.
Okay. Well, I don't see any others for you, so I think that's it for you. Again, I just want to thank you for coming on and giving us this update, as well as our other speakers. A reminder that the recording of this call will be posted within a week. And if you have any topic suggestions, please feel free to send them my way. Thanks, everyone, and have a great month. See you next month. Bye-bye.